Hello to our friends joining us via recording. We are working on lab lesson number 9 today about the brain and some of the bones and muscles of the head. To help us get ready to talk about the bones and muscles of the head in particular, we are looking at a couple of the bone markings that you're required to learn this week. One of them is this little hole that we see right here. One of them is this line that we see right here. So to help us with learning our bone markings, it's always really good to try to figure out what kind of information the names of the bone markings can give us. So we've got 3 options here for what bone marking number 1 could be. All of these options that I gave you have this word foramen in their name. Can you remind me in the chat, what does that word foramen mean? What is a foramen? Yeah, Nicole's absolutely right. A foramen is a hole. So I decided to be kind on our list of options here. I gave you all foramina, all holes. But remember that anytime you see the word foramen, it's always a hole. Okay, so we're going to look at a hole today. I'm going to type its name up above. Should be one of the easiest things for you to identify. Foramen Magnum. Foramen Magnum, this magnum means big, foramen means hole. Foramen Magnum is the really big hole in the inside of the skull. So foramen always means we're looking for some kind of hole. In this case, we're looking at a hole here. It's located here below the eye. We've got a hole above the eye here. We've got a hole in the chin here. We've got a different kind of hole that's right here. Does anyone happen to remember way back from that activity in week 6? Does anyone remember what the word was for the type of hole that we see right here? It wasn't a foramen. It was a weird one. A little line for us here. Yeah, so it was that weird word called meatus. Meatus. That's another word that means hole or means tunnel. Technically, I'll put the full name for this hole here because you do have to learn it this week. It's called the external acoustic, make sure I spell it right, acoustic meatus. That's the technical name for this hole here. Outside, the way you broke it down in that packet, outside hearing hole. That's this right here. So the external acoustic meatus, that's this one here. We don't care about this one. We don't care about this one. We don't care about this one. Right now, we're working on this one right here. So our options here are the infraorbital foramen, the mental foramen, or the supraorbital foramen. Now, I put regional terms here in italics for us to draw our attentions to them. There's 2 regional terms here. We've got the regional term orbital, and we've got the regional term mental. Can you help me out in the chat? What does the regional term orbital mean? What does orbital refer to? Yeah, the orbital region was the eye region, the orbital region. So I've got one regional term that's orbital, and then I've got that weird one, mental. Does anyone remember where in the body the mental region was? The mental region is where those regional terms we hated come back to bite us, right? Yeah, Nicole is right. The mental region is the chin region. So when I look at my names here, I've got a couple that refer to the eye region. I've got one that refers to the chin region. When I'm looking at this hole here is not by the chin. So I can cross off my mental foramen. Here, I'll actually cross it off for us. We know it's not the mental foramen because it's not by the chin. That, by the way, is the name of this one right here. I'm gonna circle it in red. This is called the mental foramen, the hole in the chin region. So we know that it's one of my orbital foramen. We know that it's by the eye. Now we need to use these parts that are here in bold to help us determine which it is. These terms that are here in bold are our directional terms. also way back from the beginning of the semester. We've got infra and we've got supra. In the chat, help me out. Infra and supra. Which directional terms do those sound like? Infra and supra. Yeah, so infra sounds a lot like and is a lot like inferior, and supra sounds a lot like and is a lot like superior. So the last thing we need to do to help us interpret these things, when I use the directional term inferior, what does that word mean? Inferior. We're still waiting on our coffee to kick in, right? Yeah, and inferior means below. Inferior means below, which means that superior, its opposite, is going to mean what? What's the opposite of below? Yep, above. Okay, so I have two things referring to the eye region. One of them is infra, or inferior, below. One of them is supra, or superior, above. Which direction are we here? Are we superior or inferior compared to the eye for number one? Are we above or below the eye? Yeah, we're inferior to, right? We're underneath the eye. Here's the orbital region, the eye. We are below the orbital region. So let me circle with blue here. Our infraorbital foramen is number one. That's this one right here, infraorbital foramen. Inferior to the orbital region or below the eye. We can also see on our picture here, though, the supraorbital foramen. Supra means superior, or it means above. So my supraorbital foramen, which I'm going to cross out, I'm going to circle here in green so you can see it. Supraorbital foramen, above the eye region. So with these three names, these three holes that you have to learn this week, remember that foramen always means hole. Look in their names for regional terms, like the orbital region, like the mental region. And for some where we have more than one thing that say the same regional term, look for those directional terms as well. The other kind of thing that you might see when you're working on our bone markings is we might see those body planes coming back to haunt us. So we're looking at one of our sutures. Now remember, sutures we talked about in lecture. When we talked about a suture, was that a joint that did or did not move? Sutures did or did not move? Yeah, Gloria's right. Sutures don't move. No movement at sutures. The skull is where I primarily find these sutures. There are 4 sutures that you are learning this semester. Some of these sutures have names that match up with body planes. So I've got one called the Coronal Suture, and I've got one called the Sagittal Suture. Those are names that match up with body planes that we talked about. So I know in our groups we were chatting about this a little bit. When we talked about using a coronal plane to divide the body, how did that divide the body? Or what kind of pieces does a coronal plane make? Switch out of green. Coronal plane. Yeah, so Nicole gave us our technical terms for them. Anterior and posterior, right? Or we can be real simple here. We'll say front and back. A coronal plane divides a body part, divides the whole body, front from back. When I talk about a sagittal plane, how does a sagittal plane divide the body? sagittal plane. Do you remember that one? Yeah, so the sagittal plane kind of goes down the middle of the body. A sagittal plane, especially if it's a mid-sagittal plane, is going to go straight through your belly button. So think about it going from the top of your head through your belly button all the way down. Sagittal planes divide the body into left and right. Left and right. So Jacqueline's mentioning in chat, wow, why can't I remember this? Yeah, we might have to do a little bit of review, right? I'll mention too, though, if you can't remember for sure, if you see something and it looks similar, definitely take the time to look it back up because it probably means the same thing. So that's why we're talking about sagittal planes here. Sagittal planes made us left and right halves. They divided us left and right. It could be equal left and right if it was a mid-sagittal plane, or it could be what we call a parasagittal plane, and those were unequal left and right parts. We actually can't see on this particular picture where the sagittal suture is because it divides the skull into left and right halves. If you can imagine, there's a little line, let me add it, that would be going down between our two, remember these were called parietal bones. So the bony line that connects our two parietal bones together, that's the one called the sagittal suture because it is found in the same kind of place that a sagittal plane would be found. When we're looking at this particular one though, bone marking number 2 here, this doesn't divide the skull into left and right parts. This divides the skull into front and back parts. So this one right here, if we were to draw this line, it would make front and back parts. This is called the coronal suture. I know there was some chatter in our groups too that the coronal suture, when you think of corona, think of a crown. So this is kind of where a crown would sit on top of the head. This is the coronal suture. So let me circle that one for us. Coronal suture. That's what marking number 2 is, the coronal suture. I'll mention, since we're looking at sutures here, just as a heads up, the squamous suture is this one that I see right here. So the squamous suture, we already said that this bone is the parietal bone. Do we happen to remember what's this funky shaped bone right here? What bone is this one? Do you know yet? It's by the ear, right? In the ear region. So this one right here is the temporal bone. Gloria mentioned another bone that's actually connected to the temporal bone. That bone is called the zygomatic bone. That's this one that I see right here. This one right here is the zygomatic bone. When you're thinking about the zygomatic bone, this is the bone that is really your cheekbone. So giving you your cheekbone structure that you see from the front is the zygomatic bone. The temporal bone is back a little bit farther because it's by that ear region, by the temporal region. Let me clear off some of my markings here really fast because I know something we mentioned in the chat is that we have a couple of bone markings. I'm going to type their names in the bottom corner here. We have what's called the zygomatic process and the temporal process. Okay, so we have talked a little bit about bone markings because we didn't talk much, did we? We spent most of our time last week on the muscles. Here's the thing with bone markings, and you've seen this on your homework assignments. Not only do you have to know the name of the bone marking, you also need to know the name of the bone that it's found on. That is an important hint when we're working on learning the zygomatic process and the temporal process. Now, these bone markings are listed in your packet. I don't expect you to know where they are just yet, but if you can, flip to the page that has a skull like this. I need you to tell me which bone do I find the zygomatic process on? Which bone do we need to learn this bone marking on? Yeah, so Nicole is repeating her answer, right? It's on the temporal bone. Okay, stay on that page because I need you to find me which bone the temporal process is on. Which bone has the temporal process? Yeah, Jacqueline's typing in, not super thrilled that the temporal process is on the zygomatic bone. You are 100% correct. And you're like, why, right? Okay, so here's the way that I remember it. I can't tell you why. I would say big picture why, because anatomy is cruel. Let's just say that, because anatomy is cruel. Here's the way you're going to memorize it, though, even though anatomy is cruel. The zygomatic process is where the temporal bone attaches to the zygomatic bone. And the temporal process is where the zygomatic bone attaches to the temporal bone. So let's find these things. I'm going to start with the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. See this part right here? Zygomatic process of the temporal bone. It's the part of the cheekbone that's over here, made of the temporal bone. In front of it, let me pick a different color that I think will show up. Ooh, that's tough. We'll try red. In front of it, right here, is the temporal process of the zygomatic bone. They are not exactly the same thing. These are the two bone markings that come together to make your cheekbone. So if you want to think of big picture, think of your cheekbone as one thing, then sure, we could say they are the same structure because they both make up the cheekbone. The front part of your cheekbone is the temporal process because the front part is made of the zygomatic bone. The back part of your cheekbone is the zygomatic process because it's made of the temporal bone. So when you feel your cheekbone from front to back, you're feeling two bone markings that come together to make this structure. The one in the front is the temporal process of the zygomatic bone, where the zygomatic bone attaches to the temporal bone. The back part of it is the zygomatic process of the temporal bone, where the temporal bone attaches to the zygomatic bone. In the chat, help me out. How do we feel about that? I can't tell, Jacqueline. Is that happy sweating? Is that almost a tear? I can't tell what that is. No. Christina's crying. I get you. Yep. So I know, why can't it be switched? Remember, we're saying because anatomy is just cruel, right? So what I want us to remember, it's just going to be a memory thing. The temporal process is on the zygomatic bone. The zygomatic process is on the temporal bone. It's one of those stupid ones that we just have to remember. And it's the place where these two bones connect. So these two processes, it's where we connect. Just remember that the name of the process, it's on the opposite bone. Not fun, I know. But hey, at least we had a chance to talk about it together and you didn't do the homework like 10 times before you figured it out, right? So we did chat about that. Help me out in the chat. I'm not sure how many of us have had a chance to do much in the lab packet, but if you know there are particular things you want to talk about, can you help me know what those things are? So if you've had a chance to work on anything, or as you're looking through the packet right now, if you see particular things that you want to look at. Okay, so Nicole wants to spend more time today on bone markings. We can definitely do that. Okay. Yeah, so we're mentioning meninges. We can definitely do meninges today. I probably will not take a lot of time to do muscles today. Muscles this week is not nearly as bad as muscles last week. We'll focus more time on our bone markings. Are we feeling okay about the brain, or we don't know if we feel okay brain? Yeah, the muscles last week, yep, they were definitely worth crying over, for sure. Muscles last week, there were a lot of them. There's not as many this week. There are a bunch again next week. So heads up, it's gonna be bad. Yeah, that's okay, Gloria. Okay, so let's see. We already talked a little bit at the beginning in group work about the locations of the lobes of the brain. What we said is that they matched up with the bone names. So keep that in mind. What I want to do then, I'll talk a little bit about the brain and we'll focus on meninges. We will talk about bone markings as well. So I want to use, let's see. I want to start with this image. And then we'll look at that other one too. This is a picture of one of the bone models that we have in the lab. And what's really nice about this one is that it's color-coded. Just like that image that we labeled in group work today, how it's color-coded. So we see different colors that represent different lobes of the brain. Can you help me out in the chat? Which lobe of the brain is kind of this orange-red thing? Can we tell what color this one is, or what the name of this one? Sorry, not the color. Yeah, so this one right here is the frontal lobe. Something that we said at the beginning of our class when we were working on our group work, when you are trying to identify the lobes of the brain, what you should reference for is this little thing down here. So this little thing down here is called the cerebellum. The cerebellum. As we will talk about it in lecture in lesson number 11, think of the cerebellum as the little cerebrum. The big parts of your brain, most of your brain is called the cerebrum. So all the stuff that makes you human, that's what happens in the cerebrum. So your ability to think, your ability to see, your ability to hear music, all of that stuff happens in the cerebrum. When we talk about other parts of the brain, like the cerebellum or parts we can't really see here called like the brain stem, those are structures that keep you alive, or the cerebellum in particular helps you to smooth out your movements, for example. All of your we call it higher order functioning though, comes from the cerebrum, the big part of the brain. So we've got the frontal lobe here. Right next to, or just behind the frontal lobe, is the lobe of the brain called the parietal lobe. Parietal lobe. The parietal lobe is found in the same place that your parietal bones would be found. Now I'm going to tell you how I remember parietal, and it may make zero sense to you, so if it's not helpful, that's totally fine. The way that I remember parietal though, for some reason, its name to me looks like teal parrots. And for some reason, I like to picture teal parrots sitting on the side of my head. So if that helps you at all, the parietal lobe, the parietal bones, those teal parrots sitting on the side of your head, I was a weird anatomy student. That came from my high school anatomy, teal parrots. So parietal lobe, if it helps you or not. This yellow one here in the front, that's my hearing lobe. The hearing lobe is the temporal lobe, temporal. And it's really hard to see in the back though. That little small one back there is the occipital lobe. So remember, these names of my lobes match up with the names of my bones, and their locations match up with those bone locations as well. There is one more lobe of the brain that we can't see in our models. We can't see it very well because it's inside in the middle of the brain. For my friends who had a chance to look at the parts of the brain, what's the name of this inner lobe that we see here in the very middle of the brain? Did anyone cover that yet? Yeah, so the one in the very middle is called the insula. The insula. So if we peeked underneath the temporal lobe, underneath the frontal lobe, underneath the parietal lobe, kind of in the middle where they all meet. If we went to the layer underneath these, we would see the inner lobe called the insula. So technically the brain has 5 lobes. Number 1, frontal. Number 2, parietal. Number 3, occipital. Number 4, temporal. And then down deep, number 5, the insula. So the 5 lobes of the cerebrum. Again, the cerebrum is this whole big thing that we see here, the part that you normally think about with the brain. Back behind it is that part called the cerebellum, which is a lot like the cerebrum, just smaller. And some other parts that we're learning this week, all of these parts right here make up what is called the brain stem. So there's this big bumpy part here that we'll look at better on a different view here. That's something called the pons. And underneath the pons is something called the Medulla Oblongata. Medulla Oblongata. That's the smaller bump that you see right here. So these are parts of my structure that make up the brain stem. The brain stem keeps you alive. All of my lobes of the cerebrum up here helps you to be human, helps you to do those higher order functions. Now, wrapping around the cerebrum, let's talk about the meninges, the stuff on page 4. Wrapping around the cerebrum, here's the brain, the cerebrum. We have connective tissue. I know it's kind of hard when you're looking at the picture on page 4 to kind of get a frame of reference. So I'm pulling up that picture so I can see it. That picture most closely matches this. But this doesn't make sense unless you're thinking about what the brain looks like. So I know this is kind of funky for us. Imagine that we did a coronal section of the brain. So we divided the brain, the front from the back. When we look at the brain, we have bumps and we have divots. So the bumps in my brain, on the outside of the brain, are things called gyri, or if we're just talking about one of them, it's called a gyrus. That's one of them. My indentations are things that are called sulci, or if there's just one of them, it's called a sulcus. So when you look at the brain, you can see a bump right here, and then an indentation, and a bump right here, and an indentation. So gyri and sulci, my bumps and my indentations between my bumps. This is a really good thing for you. It's good that your brain is not smooth on the outside, because by having these bumps and these indentations, we increase the surface area of your brain, or we increase the amount of space inside your skull that we can have our thinking cells, our processing cells. I know you guys can answer this question, even if you haven't done the lab packet yet. What's the name of the kind of cells in your body that allow you to think? What were those cells we looked at models of last week? Thinker cells. Yep, Gloria's right. Thinker cells in our body are called the neurons. When we look at our brain, we've got a whole lot of neurons here in this outer portion of the brain. This is called the gray matter of the brain. It gets its name because it looks gray. It doesn't have as much myelin in it. We've got a whole lot of the thinking parts of our neurons. So when we talk about neurons, let's do a quick neuron review here. I'm going to draw my neurons to get us ready and excited for lesson 10 in lecture. Remember that we drew ourselves some neurons last week. When we talked about neurons, we had this part here called the cell body. We had this part here called the axon. Then we had our little places that receive messages. These little message receiving places were called dendrites. Does anyone remember from last week, was it the cell body the dendrites, or the axon that had myelin on it? Which part of a neuron has myelin? Yeah, so a couple of us are chiming in correctly. The place on my neuron that would have myelin is right here, this part called the axon. So this part here, the cell body and those dendrites, these are the parts of the neuron that process information. So they receive information, they mix it together, they do something. Here's the word we used for it last week. We called it integration. When my neurons mix together the messages that they have to figure out what to do about it. That's the job of the cell body and the dendrites. And the cell bodies and the dendrites, they don't have a myelin sheath on them. So when you look at the brain and you see these parts here that are gray, these are the parts or the places inside the brain where I'm going to see a whole lot of cell bodies and I'm going to see a whole lot of dendrites. So the processing parts of the brain or the thinking parts of the brain, that's found in the gray matter of the brain. The gray matter of the brain is found inside these bumps and these indentations, inside the gyri and the sulci. So instead of just having one flat surface where I can only find my cell bodies in one place, I have these indentations, I have these raised parts that increases surface area, that allows me to have more neurons. When I look at these bumps and these indentations, I want to make sure that they're protected. So the way that I protect them is by covering them in some connective tissue things called meninges. Meninges. So whenever you see meninges, you should just think connective tissue. This is a protective connective tissue layer that I see wrapping around my brain and my spinal cord, the meninges. The meninges are made of 3 layers. The name of these layers are maters. It's a Latin word. It literally means mother. So I've got 3 protective mother layers, if you will, around the brain, the maters. So deepest, the layer that is closest to the brain, it's actually touching the brain, is a thin layer called the Pia Mater. This word Pia means gentle. So the Pia Mater is a thin connective tissue layer that's attached directly to the brain. Outside of the Pia Mater, all these little kind of spider web looking lines that you see right here, those make up something called the Arachnoid Mater. The Arachnoid Mater, kind of like arachnophobia, fear of spiders. The Arachnoid Mater looks like spider webs, and it's connective tissue. All of these little spider webs that you see are actually collagen proteins. Remember collagen that we said was in your skin, and collagen that we said was inside your bones? We see it here in the Arachnoid Mater as well, collagen proteins here. The outermost layer of connective tissue, the last mater layer on the outside, is something called the Dura Mater. Dura Mater, Dura means tough. So the tough connective tissue layer on the outside, the thickest connective tissue layer, is called the Dura Mater. And this layer is actually attached to your skull bones. So part of the job of the Dura Mater is to help hold the brain in place. The Dura Mater also has a space, though, where it splits. The Dura Mater is made of 2 layers of connective tissue, like it says here. So there's a place in between my parts of the Dura Mater. So Dura Mater is in white right here. There's a place in between them where I see this blue right here. It's called the dural venous sinus. A sinus is a blood vessel. So in the very top of your head, we have a place in between the 2 lobes of the cerebrum. We have a place where there's blood. This is where I recycle my blood that doesn't have any oxygen, the dural venous sinus. That's formed when my thick Dura Mater splits into its two parts, and that's going to allow me to get rid of oxygen poor blood that I have circulating around my brain. Once it has no oxygen and has no nutrients, I don't there, so I'm going to get rid of it. Quick recap before we start trying to label things on our image here. Remember that meninges are connective tissue. Their job is to protect and surround the brain. We have 3 meninges. They're all called maters. Part of their name includes mater. The Pia Mater, that's closest to the brain, the Arachnoid Mater, that looks like spider webs, and the Dura Mater, which is the outermost layer, that's the thickest, that's going to split in the very middle to have a space for us to put old blood that we don't need anymore. That brings us to the picture you have on page 4. Now, if you have the ability to split screen, I would recommend pulling up the guided lesson, because that picture I was showing you guys, let me go back to it. This picture right here is in the guided lesson for you. As you're working on labeling, this is the one that it's closest to, that it matches the most. So let's work on it together. When we are labeling this picture, I should have included my little table of things we're going to label. One of the things that we need to label is the place in our picture here where we see the bone. I'm going to go ahead and grab that pencil up there for my friends in class today. Can you show me, using an arrow or a circle, can we tell where we see some bone on this model? See if we can figure out where the bone is. Any ideas? Exactly. Yep. So we're finding that bone. The outer parts of this bone that we're seeing here is compact bone. All the little red splotches you're seeing in the middle here, that's because in the middle of this bone, we have spongy bone connective tissue. So we're seeing compact bone on the outside, that's completely solid, and then spongy bone here in the middle, that's more pink in color. As a heads up, something you don't have to label, I've got some cells out here that are really big. They're called adipocytes. What kind of tissue am I seeing right here? These cells are adipocytes. Anyone remember what that tissue was called? Yeah, exactly. Adipose, I'll give you the full name. Well, I'll abbreviate. Adipose loose connective tissue. So when we were studying adipose tissue, we said the most common place to find it was in the hypodermis, or the subcutaneous layer of the skin. So even on your scalp, underneath your skin, here's your skin on the outside of your body. Right underneath that, I've got some fatty tissue. That fatty tissue is on the outside of my bone. So if we were going from the outside in, skin here on the outside, little bit of fat, and we've got our bone. Then we bump into this thick connective tissue layer. This is my first mater layer. This is the one that we said was tough or really thick. Which mater layer do I see right here? Which mater is this one? Yeah, this is the one called the Dura Mater. The Dura Mater. And all of this here is the Dura Mater. Remember from what we talked about before, the Dura Mater, oops, somebody added a line. Dura Mater, might have been me. Let's delete it. Okay, try again. The Dura Mater is made of 2 parts. So I can see where those 2 parts split right here. When my 2 parts split, we make that blood-filled space that we call the dural venous sinus. So the dural venous sinus is what we see right here in our picture. If you have a colored pen with you or a pencil, what you might want to do to help you remember the what this thing is add a little bit of red inside here. This is where we have oxygen poor blood, the dural venous sinus. So it's a space in between the layers of the dura where I drain blood away from the brain. So here's my dural venous sinus, this space, that's what a sinus is, an open space. Dural venous sinus up here inside the Dura Mater. Right underneath the Dura Mater, I have this kind of seafoam green layer that's got all these little spider webs in it. What would I call this layer right here? What's this spider web layer called? Yeah, that's the one that's called, let's see if I can spell it, Arachnoid Mater. So the Arachnoid Mater is this section in here. All of these little stringy proteins and this layer that I see right here that defines them, that's the Arachnoid Mater. Remember that the Pia Mater was directly attached to the brain. The Pia Mater is this really thin pink layer that you see right here attached to the brain. So the Pia Mater, I'm going to change colors here. That's that little pink thing that you see right there, the Pia Mater. Remember that Pia means gentle. So the Pia Mater is this really thin, gentle layer that's touching the outside of the brain. The brain itself, remember we said was called the cerebrum. So when I'm looking at my picture here, all of this with its gray matter and its white matter, all of this is the cerebrum. This is the brain tissue, everything. So here, let's circle it. Oh, that color's not a good pick. Let's try again. Everything that's underneath the Pia Mater, that is the cerebrum. The cerebrum. Cerebrum, again, the name of the brain. Okay, two more things I see on that list that we need to label. One of those things that we need to label was called a gyrus. Does anyone remember from our description? What's the easy word for what a gyrus is? What's a gyrus? Do you remember? Yep, exactly, Nicole. My gyri or a gyrus is a bump. So I'm going to add a little arrow right here pointing to the part that's sticking up a little bit. That's my gyrus, my bump. Notice that I have, I'm going to circle it here, a small sulcus next to it. That's an indentation. Or I have a bigger sulcus that I can see right here. I just put a big circle around it. Both of those would be considered a sulcus. A sulcus is a place where the brain tissue has an indentation. So whether it's a little indentation or whether it's a big indentation, a place where the brain tissue goes down is a sulcus. A place where the brain tissue goes up is a gyrus. I'm going to make you use your mad scientist skills here. The one other structure that we need to label is something called the subarachnoid space. The subarachnoid space. This beginning part, sub. Any ideas what sub might mean? Yeah, so we're totally right. Sub means below or underneath. I promise this is not a trick question. The subarachnoid space is a space that is under what? Not a trick question, I promise. Exactly. Subarachnoid space is just the space underneath the arachnoid mater. So here, I'm going to color it. Oh, that was not what I meant to do. Sorry, guys. I'm going to color that space. Now we have all the space in the world. I'm adding some pink lines here. Basically, where those little stringies, those little spider webs go down, that's the area called the subarachnoid space. Subarachnoid space, underneath the arachnoid mater. The reason the subarachnoid space matters is because this is going to be the place around the brain where we find cerebrospinal fluid, where we find CSF. In next week's lab, we're going to talk about places inside the brain where we find CSF, cerebrospinal fluid. But for now, we're talking about this space on the outside, where outside of the brain, called the subarachnoid space. Yeah, so the question in the chat is it the white space? Yeah, so it's all the space inside here where we see these little stringies coming down. The space in between those little stringies is the subarachnoid space. This green line is the arachnoid mater with all its little extensions coming down. But all of the white space underneath the arachnoid mater is what we call the subarachnoid space. So we label the arachnoid mater, you can get technical and label it right here. That's my point. It includes these little extensions that come off of it. They're all part of the arachnoid mater. Where I see it the best is that seafoam green layer. And the white space underneath it, you'll probably see on the homework this subarachnoid space with a bracket. So the space is the bracket. The tissue itself, or the mater itself, is this an arrow pointing to this layer. The space under it is the subarachnoid space. What other questions do we have about this model? Or shoot me an emoji. How are we feeling in general? Doesn't have to be good. Here's my emoji. I'll send you a penguin. It's been a while. Yep, it is a lot of information. As always, it's going to take a lot of practice, right? Lots of practicing. Okay. Let's see. I'm going to bounce back really fast to mention something on this image that we didn't talk a lot about before. We talked about how a gyrus is a bump, and we talked about how a sulcus is an indentation. There are two gyri, or two bumps, that we have to know, and one really important sulcus in between them. So when we're looking at this picture, this color-coded model here, it's really easy for us to see the two bumps and the indentation that we need to know. So let's start with the indentation. This right here, the dividing line between our two bumps here, this indentation that we see in the middle of our two bumps is called the central sulcus. Central sulcus. The central sulcus divides up the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. The central sulcus divides up those two things. The other thing from a functional perspective, here's something to keep in the back of your mind because this will be more lecture focused. The central sulcus divides up the motor parts of the brain, which is the frontal lobe, from the sensory parts of the brain. It starts with parietal, includes temporal, includes occipital. The motor parts of your brain help you to move, that help you to plan what you're going to say, or help you kind of say things like that. That's the frontal lobe. Touch sensations, hearing sensations, vision sensations, all of those are in the back half of the brain. So the central sulcus divides up sensory and motor areas of the brain. It also divides up two very important gyri. We have what's called the pre-central gyrus and the post-central gyrus. Okay, I promise this is not a trick question here. Pre-central gyrus. Where do you think the pre-central gyrus is found compared to the central sulcus? What do we think pre might mean? Yeah, pre, in front of or before, right? If you take a pre-test, it's something you do before you learn anything. So the pre-central gyrus is the bump that's in front of the central sulcus. So when we're looking at our color-coded brain here, the red one is the pre-central gyrus. Hey, remind me in the chat, what is the name of the lobe of the brain that the pre-central gyrus is found inside of? Which lobe is that red-orange lobe up there? Yeah, absolutely right. That red-orange one up there is the frontal lobe, the frontal lobe. So that means my post-central gyrus is going to be the bump that is behind. Post means after. So the post-central gyrus is where I begin my sensory functions. We will talk about in lecture, here I'll give you a teaser here, some things called a homunculus. I'll show you that word so when you see it in 11, it doesn't freak you out quite as much. Homunculus. This word kind of means a map of a person, their homunculus. So in the pre-central gyrus, the red one, we have what's called the motor homunculus. Every part of your body that has skeletal muscle has a region on this motor homunculus, somewhere on this bump, where the neurons live that control that part of the body. So we've got parts that are for your face, and parts that are for your legs, and parts that are for your arms. There's a map here of your entire body called a homunculus. That's how I control different parts of my body. On this post-central gyrus here, we have what's called the sensory homunculus. So when your fingers feel something, they're going to send that information here. Whereas if your nose feels something, it sends it here. Or if your leg feels something, it might send it here. So we've got a sensory map along this post-central gyrus to have a specific place for all the sensory information to go to. So the reason we're mentioning these two bumps here, the pre-central gyrus and the post-central gyrus, is because they're really important for movements and they're really important for sensory information. So besides just those lobes, make sure we can identify on these pictures here that central sulcus and the pre and post central gyrus. If I'm going to ask you about those structures, which I'm going to be honest, I will ask you about at least one of them on your final exam, we will use the color-coded model so that you know for sure whether we're looking at the pre-central or the post-central gyrus. Let's go to our big model. Our big model here, can you tell me what page this one's on? What page is this one on? Okay, so Nicole says we're here on page 5. This model here, you see listed a ton of different things that you are locating on it. So this is, once you've gone through and learned about the various parts of the brain, this is where you now have a chance to apply them all on one picture. The goal of this is to show us everything together, the way that all of our body structures work together. So let's start with a few things that we've talked a little bit about, label some of our big things. that we're identifying on this picture. First thing that we have talked about, and I'm going to draw a circle around it, is this little thing in the back part underneath the brain. What is the name of that brown thing back there? Do we remember? The thing that helps us tell front from back. Yep. That thing back there is called the cerebellum. Cerebellum. Remember that the cerebellum is underneath the cerebrum. That's the big part of the brain here. So we've got the little cerebellum that's underneath the cerebrum. We're not asking you to identify the cerebrum as a whole. This whole thing is the cerebrum. What we need to remember is the location of various lobes of the brain. So let's draw some arrows here. Okay, so when I'm looking at the lobe of the cerebrum that's touching the cerebellum, which lobe touches the cerebellum? Which one's back here? Exactly. Yep, I got my occipital lobe back here. Occipital lobe. And above the occipital lobe, the place where we've got those teal parrots sitting, which lobe is up above that? Yep, parietal lobe. Parietal lobe. And the one on the anterior side of the brain, what's that one called? My last arrow up there. Yeah, that last arrow up there is the frontal lobe. Frontal lobe. Okay, so we've labeled our lobes that we can see. Now we've labeled the cerebellum. Hey, let me mention this structure right here, this white thing. This is an underline highlight star. Absolutely must know it. I guarantee it will be on your lab exam. So that is the most wink, wink, nudge, nudge I can give you. We got to know this guy right here. This thing is called the Corpus Callosum. The Corpus Callosum, this white thing right here. The reason we must know the Corpus Callosum is because the job of this structure is to connect the left and the right sides of your brain. It's really important that the left side and the right side talk to each other. The Corpus Callosum allows them to talk to each other. Fun fact, you can have a procedure done called a Corpus Colostomy. A Corpus Colostomy. If a patient has a Corpus Colostomy, they literally cut the Corpus Callosum in half. This prevents the left side and the right side of the brain from talking to each other. They don't do this procedure very often, but if someone has really severe seizures, this is one way that you could treat those seizures. Because sometimes a seizure is caused by both sides of the brain trying to control the same body structure, and it causes things to go haywire. So if I cut this communication line in half, the corpus callosum, that might stop the seizures. So corpus callosum, we see this band of white matter right here. It actually extends from one half of the brain into the other, allowing us to connect the two sides together. Corpus callosum. Make sure we know that one. Other structures that I'll label right now, I'm going to put a little circle around a region. This little region that I just circled and labeled here is a part called the midbrain. Midbrain. Think of the midbrain as my connection point between the cerebrum and the rest of the brain stem. So the brain stem keeps you alive. The midbrain, the pons, and the medulla, all of these are structures that help you to stay alive. So let's label them. I mentioned their names fast. The big bump that you see right there is called the pons. The smaller bump, I'll kind of circle it here, That's called the Medulla Oblongata. The Medulla Oblongata is the last part of the brainstem, and it actually connects directly to the spinal cord. So the spinal cord connects to the brainstem using the Medulla Oblongata. Up above that is the pons. Up above that is the midbrain. Let me check my list here. Okay. One of the things on the midbrain, I'm actually going to delete my midbrain circle here. One of the things you need to know on the midbrain is a structure on the back side of it. I know it's a little hard to see here, but on the back side of this midbrain area here, just above the cerebellum, we have what's known as the Corpora Quadrigemina. Let me type it and then I'll make an arrow. Corpora Quadrigemina. Corpora Quadrigemina are the bumps that you see here, the bumps, Corpora Quadrigemina. I told you that the brainstem keeps you alive. The way that these bumps help to keep you alive is they are reflex centers. So reflexes for visual and auditory stimuli. So what I mean by that is when you're driving down the road and you hear screeching tires, you know how you kind of tense up and maybe put your own brakes on? That is an auditory reflex. That's there to help keep you safe, keep you alive. Or a visual reflex. I always joke that if I was a mean teacher, I would throw a textbook at you and it would cause you to jump, right? Or you'd move out of the way. That's a visual reflex. So the Corpora Quadrigemina, its name literally means 4 bodies. It's a set of 4 bumps on the backside of the midbrain that allows you to have visual or auditory reflexes. Let me kind of move them out of the way. Actually, I'm just going to delete that circle here because we also need to know about this little structure right here. This little pink structure right here that I'm pointing at is called the pineal gland. And the pineal gland is what makes melatonin. Does anyone happen to know what happens in your body when you make melatonin? What happens when we make melatonin? Yeah, Jacqueline's right. Makes you sleepy. Yeah, so Jacqueline says she takes it. Absolutely, a lot of people take it over the counter. Melatonin, it's a sleep supplement. So melatonin is a hormone that's made by your body. It's supposed to be made when it's bedtime. Sometimes it's made when it's not bedtime. That is problematic, right? It makes you tired when you shouldn't be. But that's the job of this little thing back here, the pineal gland. Makes melatonin for us. I'm looking at my list here. We had the Corpus Callosum, this big white thing right here. The smaller white thing that you see right here is called the fornix. The fornix, let me type it. I'll just type its name right above it. So the fornix is this smaller white band that you see here. This is something that's part of the limbic system, which is your emotional brain. The fornix is how we make memories, one of the ways we make memories. So this helps us to bring information in to help us make memories, the fornix. And then the corpus callosum, connecting the left and the right side together. Hey, this big area here in the middle, is a part of the brain known as the thalamus. Here, I'm going to erase and start over so we have more space. This big area right here that I just circled, that's called the thalamus. So the thalamus, we will talk about in lecture, is a relay center. It sends information up to the brain for the brain to process it, or it sends information down to the body for the body to use it to move, for example. So this duck face that you see here in the middle, that area is called the thalamus of the brain. Now below the thalamus, you kind of have a bill of the duck, kind of. So let me see if I can draw my duck bill here. And you kind of see that duck bill I drew in orange there? This area right here is called the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is below the thalamus. So down below the duck's head is its beak, hypothalamus. The hypothalamus does homeostasis, which is keeping your body regulated, keeping your body alive. The hypothalamus is attached to a little thing you can see right here in pink, a little thing called the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland secretes a lot of hormones, things like growth hormones or sex hormones. Pituitary gland you will study in depth in A&P2. Lots of important hormones that it makes. And the hypothalamus actually controls a lot of what happens with the pituitary gland here. So we've got the thalamus, we've got the hypothalamus, we've got the pituitary gland here. One other thing with my duck, see his little eye right here? The duck eye right here is something called the intermediate mass of the thalamus. Let me get my typing back here. Intermediate mass. It's literally just the eye of the duck right here. Oops. That duck eye is a lot like the corpus callosum. It connects the two sides of the thalamus together. So this intermediate mass of the thalamus connects the left and the right half of the thalamus together. The corpus callosum connects the left and the right half of the cerebrum together. Looks like there are maybe 2 or 3 things we've missed. Let me see if any of us know this yet. One of the things that we don't have labeled yet is called the Arbor Vitae. Does anyone happen to know where in the brain the Arbor Vitae is? Arbor Vitae. Oh, nice. Someone circled it for me. Awesome. Tree of life is what Arbor Vitae literally means. The Arbor Vitae is I think, one of the prettiest things in the brain. It's the pattern of the white matter that's inside the middle of the cerebellum. So if you ever look at pictures of like a cross-section view of a human brain, you can see a beautiful pattern inside the cerebellum, where all the gray matter is on the outside and all the white matter is in the middle. So the white matter of the cerebellum is called the Arbor Vitae, the tree of life. So it's all this white branching pattern that we see inside here. Another thing that we have not labeled is the thing called the dural venous sinus. Who can remember from our chat, what is the dural venous sinus filled with? What's inside of this thing? Do we remember? Yep, Nicole's right. The dural venous sinus is filled with blood. It's filled with oxygen-poor blood, and it actually runs all the way from the front to the back of the brain. Remember, it's a place where the Dura Mater splits in half for us to put blood in between those layers. So the dural venous sinus is this blue space filled with oxygen-poor blood. The Dura Mater, that meninge connective tissue layer, let me color it a little bit here in yellow. It's the stuff that's white at the top and then that's white underneath that dural venous sinus. So I can see the 2 parts of the Dura Mater where it's split to allow blood to go in between them. So the dural venous sinus is framed in by the Dura Mater on either side. I know we didn't specifically label bone. Grab that pencil, show me. Where's the bone on this picture? There's all kinds of bone. What are some places we see bone? Yep. You can see it in the front, you can see it on the top, you can see it in the back. Hey, let's do some application here. We can see some bones right here. What is the name of these bones right here? What are these bones called? Ones in the neck. Do we remember? Yep, they're cervical. That's the first part of their name. What's the name of the bones in the spine? These are the cervical vertebrae. Exactly. Yep, we're seeing the cervical vertebrae. So there's another place that we would have the vertebrae. Miriam's asking about a structure called the confluence of sinus, or it probably is of sinuses, plural. That's going to be a place where a group of blood vessels, all the different, so we talked about the dural venous sinus. That's one of the sinuses, one of the big blood vessels that drain blood out of the brain. There's also a sagittal sinus. There's also I'm trying to remember the other ones. I think we have here, Google Images is my friend. Let's find us all those sinuses. Brain sinuses. I think there's a sagittal one as well, but I might be wrong. Okay, let me share my screen with you here. The short answer to your question really fast, Miriam, is the confluence would be right here where they all meet together. But let me show you 3D. Here it comes. Here's the one that we're looking at right here. We're calling it the dural venous sinus. Technically, a lot of pictures will label it the superior sagittal sinus up here. And we have a transverse sinus. We have this area in the middle that the oxygen-rich version of it's called the circle of Willis, but we got some oxygen-poor blood vessels inside there. So all of these blue things that we see around the brain are places where we have oxygen-poor blood. I dump all of them together here in this place called the confluence of sinuses, and then I drain all of that down and out through the jugular veins. So the jugular veins collect all of that old oxygen-poor blood and take it out of the brain. So here's the one that we're seeing on our models right here. Technically, superior sagittal sinus, we're just going to call it the dural venous sinus. What other questions do we have right now? I know it's a lot to process. Let me just mention, you have 2 visible body assignments due this week. One of them is in the brain. Here is the view of the brain. I just went into the practice assignment for this week. The view of the brain that looks like our picture that we just spent a bunch of time labeling. Let me take out, we're going to talk about this next week. We're going to take out that ventricle because we'll talk about that next time. Go away. Oh, it took the thalamus with it. Okay, let's undo. We'll leave it there. Okay. So we talked about the duck face, right? Here's the duck face, that's the thalamus. Here's that thing called the intermediate mass, or sometimes they call it the interthalamic adhesion. Down below my duckbill that I see right there, there's my hypothalamus making that duckbill. Hanging down below the brain is the little thing called the pituitary gland. There's multiple parts to it. So see how they're calling it the posterior pituitary. It's part of the pituitary gland. We've got that big bump on the front called the pons. Up above it was that area called the midbrain. And then we have on the back those bumps that I was telling you about. So here's one of them, and here's the other one. Together, these things are called Corpora Quadrigemina, looking at half of the brain, right? So here's 1 and 2 on half of my brain. The other half of the brain would have the other 2. So on the back of this structure called the midbrain are those 2 bumps, Corpora Quadrigemina, that help us out with auditory and visual reflexes. This whole structure here is the cerebellum. See the tree of life? Oh, I guess I don't have a label. Ah. The arbor vitae is the white matter that's here in the middle. As an aside, a fun fact for here, the gray matter here is called folia, like foliage, like leaves. So we've got our tree of life that's in white, and then we've got our leaves on that tree of life. That's the gray matter there. Let's see, down below is our medulla oblongata. Let's see if I can move it. Yep, so medulla oblongata, the pons is up above it, and then that midbrain area up into the brain. Here's my favorite. Remember, corpus callosum. Gotta know that. When I rotate it, let's see if I can rotate. You can kind of tell it goes into the brain. The other half of it would go into the other half of the brain as well. We'll rotate to the outside here to show you our friend the post-central gyrus and our friend the pre-central gyrus. Does anyone happen to remember? Oh, here, let me hide that. Does anyone happen to remember, was it the pre-central or the post-central that was my motor information? Pre-central or post-central? Yeah, motor's in the front half. So the front half of the brain is the pre-central gyrus. That's where all of my motor directions come from. So again, we've got that thing called the homunculus, the map, that controls different parts of my body. That's why when a person has a stroke, they might lose the ability to use their hand, but still have no problems with their feet, for example. If they just damaged one small part of this gyrus and not the rest of it, the rest of their body might be intact, but they can't use that one small part. So the motor cortex in the pre-central gyrus, post-central gyrus has the sensory one inside of it. Are there any other structures you'd like me to show you in visible body before you have a chance to play with it? Oops. Check my chat here. Tyranny had asked a question in the chat, how much the visible body is worth. Visible body is 20% of your lab grade. So 20% of the lab grade, lab is worth 30% of your overall grade. So it's not gonna, totally terrorize your grade, but it does help your lab grade. Okay, we are super tired and super overwhelmed. My guess would be we need to have an emoji party because we got to get our energy back up. Let's have an emoji party together. Give me some emojis, good, bad, ugly, whatever. Remember, we can do a search bar in the emojis. Jacqueline's mind is blown. Tyranny is a vampire. I like it. Let's see. I'm going to send an owl again because I do like the owls. Yeah, Karina, I need more coffee too. As we're chatting here with emojis, I have to say I'm super excited that peppermint mocha creamer is back in the grocery store. I'm feeling Christmas. Ah, Miriam, that is a very apt emoji to be sending today, right? The brain. That's perfect. I know, Tierney, it's so good. I'd forgotten how good it is. I'm living for Christmas, right? We're all just trying to make it to Christmas. Gloria said it's going to be Christmas the day after Halloween. That's awesome. Yeah, I think we're going to decorate early this year too. Because why not, right? We might as well. Okay. So we've got about 30 minutes left. I know we wanted to do some bone markings. Let me see if I had a good, those are all brain. Let me see if we specifically had the bones. Otherwise, I'll just pull out a skeleton. Okay, perfect. Let's do this. For my friends who have had a chance to start working on the packet, are there particular bone markings you want to make sure that I emphasize today? Can you help me out so I make sure to address particular ones that you're interested in? Let me mention while we're typing, I don't know if they have the foramen. They do, look at that. Infraorbital foramen. That was one of our ones that we worked on, right? Infraorbital foramen. It's the hole, or something that's called a canal. If it's really open, it's a canal. So infraorbital foramen, they don't really show the supraorbital foramen, but there'd be a hole up here. Remember the other that we mentioned was the mental foramen down inside the mandible. And we were chatting earlier that sometimes we mix up our maxilla, that's the jawbone on the top, and our mandible, which is the jawbone on the bottom. So make sure that we are practicing that the maxilla is up higher and the mandible is down below. So Jacqueline asked about the concha bones. While we're at it, let me just see if I can show you them from the front. There's one of them. Inferior nasal concha will go inside the nose a little bit. So see that little guy in there and then up a little bit higher. Oops, that's my lacrimal bone. Oops. Where did the superior go? I'm struggling to find superior. We can find inferior for sure. I probably need to dissect away some stuff to peek inside. I'm going to be honest with you. We're only going to ask you about the inferior nasal concha because it's easier to see here. Let me pull up my worksheet and I'll see if we can actually see the superior. I guess so. Here, let me pull the worksheet over really fast to show you. You can see, oops, it's stuck. There we go. On this picture, we can see the superior concha. See these two things right here? That's the superior ones. Here's the inferior ones. This is just terrible. Sorry, guys. It's so much better in visible body. The two green ones are the inferior nasal concha. The superior nasal concha are the two orange ones or red ones that are up, though. The middle, okay, I apologize. So we've got the inferior in the middle is what we're seeing. The superior is the one that I absolutely can't find. So inferior nasal concha, middle nasal concha, the superior would be up way high. We can't see those ones. Inferior, middle, superior is hiding. Tierney asked if all of the bone markings will be on the exam. Yes, I know it sucks. Okay, so let me go back here to visible body. Bone names, we can definitely see in here. Here's some of the bone markings we talked about before. They don't have it labeled, but this right here is the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. This is the temporal process of the zygomatic bone. Remember, these two things come together to make your cheekbone. So the two things that make up the cheekbone, the temporal process of the zygomatic bone, the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. Here's that outside hearing hole, remember, external acoustic meatus, outside hearing hole. One of the big things for us to know, the big, well, literally big thing, haha. I guess they don't have it labeled, let me tell you. This thing right here, oh wait, bone markings. Aha, okay, we take it by itself. This right here is called the mastoid process of the temporal bone. So the mastoid process of the temporal bone is the big thing on the back of the skull. The styloid process of the temporal bone is the small thing that sticks down below it, the styloid process. Here's where they've got it labeled for us. The zygomatic process of the temporal bone is the part of your cheekbone that's on the temporal bone. So zygomatic process, mastoid process, styloid process. Remember, processes are always things that stick up. And then that external acoustic meatus, or the hearing hole. Does that work for you, Gloria? So when we're looking at a big picture, it's right here. Styloid process is the little one right there. Mastoid process is the massive one, the big one back here. On the occipital bone, we have to know this big bump right here. Let's go to bone markings, occipital bone in the back. We need to know this big central thing called the external occipital protuberance. It's literally a triangle-shaped thing that protrudes, that sticks out. This is a good place for muscle attachment. Next to that big protuberance, that big bump, notice that I have these two pink lines. They're blue now because I clicked on them. They're called the superior nuchal line, and down below them, the inferior nuchal line. Those are just bumps that I see on the back side of the occipital bone. So let's go back. Here's the external occipital protuberance. Next to it is the superior nuchal line. I can see it better over here. And then that inferior nuchal line there next to it. Hey, check this out. This is a really big hole. What's my anatomy word for a hole again? What word means a hole? Yep, Karina's got it. Foramen. This big thing right here, which it probably won't let me click in. We'll try. Nope. Oh, no, it did. Perfect. This thing right here is called the Foramen Magnum, the really big hole. Do you want to take a guess? What do you think passes through the Foramen Magnum? What is this a space for? What am I going to find inside here? So the vertebrae are next to it. The vertebrae would be right under it. What's inside those vertebrae? Yeah, so the brainstem and the spinal cord, exactly. Yep, the brainstem and the spinal cord are going to pass through this hole here. Specifically, it's the very beginnings of the spinal cord. So the brainstem is kind of embedded. Let's see if we can go inside the bone without it being too creepy. Your teacher is nerding out right now. This is so cool. I'm just going to have to delete. Let me delete some bones here. Get rid of those teal parrots. Oh, not that one. We need that one. Okay. The brainstem is going to be embedded kind of right here, and then down into the hole itself is where I kind of have the medulla oblongata and the spinal cord that goes through. So when we're inside the skull, there's the foramen magnum. The spinal cord would be down below it. Inside the skull, we've got some important bone markings too. This bone right here is one that we definitely need to become familiar with, called the sphenoid bone. So the sphenoid bone kind of looks like a bat, if you see its big wings here. A few important bone markings for us to know in the sphenoid bone. I'll show them to you in context, then we'll look at the sphenoid bone by itself. See this 3D space right here? Let's do some more deleting. See this space right here? Zoom in. This space right here is called the sella turcica. So the sella turcica, or the Turkish saddle, is what it really means, is the place where that pituitary gland that we were looking at with the brain, where it hangs down underneath the brain. So inside our bat-shaped bone, I've got this nice sella turcica for the pituitary gland. I also have, let's see if they have them labeled. Perfect. The optic foramen. Hey, not a trick question. Where do you think this hole goes to? The optic foramen. Where's that going to go to if I pass through here? Yeah, into the eyes. So this is the place where our cranial nerve number 2, the optic nerve, will go off of the brain and go into the eye socket. So here's that little hole that we were looking at right here. The optic foramen. So the optic foramen is the space where I send a nerve that's attached to the brain down into the eyeball. The optic foramen right there. So that's stuff on my sphenoid bone, my bat-shaped bone. Hey, another important set of markings to know is this right here. Well, let me zoom out to give you context. We're looking at a bone right here that's called the ethmoid bone. The ethmoid bone has two important structures. The first structure is this thing you see sticking up. This thing that you see sticking up is called the crista galli. So it's a big thing that sticks up. Here we can see it sticking up. And then down below it, you see some spaces that have, see those little dots on them? Those little dots are called cribriform foramina. So the place where all of the little dots are found, this space right here, is called the cribriform plate. This is the place that actually connects, let's see if we can get there easily. This connects with your nasal cavity. Oops, too far. Can't really see it. We're looking up their nose. I'm failing at the visualization. But up here in the top of the nose would be where those cribriform plates would be. Let me zoom out so give us some context. The cribriform plates have little holes in them for nerves to come down from the brain down into your nasal cavity so that you can smell. So hiding way up there inside your nose, where you have a place called the olfactory epithelium, that's what would be on the other side of our cribriform plate, the place with the little holes inside there. Let's see. What else are we interested in seeing? Side view of that one. So like this. Yeah, so when we're looking at the side view of the sphenoid bone, I think the only things we have to find on it are the sella turcica. So the little saddle, you see that saddle-shaped structure right there, that space. And then those optic canals. Do we have to know any of the blood vessel holes? I can't remember. Ooh, why did I close my worksheet? Bear with me while I reopen the worksheet. I have a chat question. Let's see. So it's an internal structure that doesn't go outside. Sella turcica, is that what you're particularly asking about? Sella turcica is only inside, if that's what you're asking about. The optic canal we see inside and outside. Yeah, so the saddle one, sella turcica, we do only see that one inside. So the view, let's see if I can get it to refresh. We'll just start over. The view I see sella turcica in is when we're looking down into the skull. We'll take away the parietal bones. This is the view that we would see sella turcica in your lab packet. And we would see the sella turcica right here. Ooh, not dissect. Right here, this divot space inside my bat, sella turcica. We'll only see that one inside. And those little optic canals there. Let's see. I'm checking out my worksheets. You can go to that inferior view. Here, let's start over. Inferior view. When we look at the inferior view of the skull, I'm going to go ahead and take away this little guy there. That's called the hyoid bone. The hyoid bone is the one bone in the body that's not actually attached to any other bones. So it was hanging down here, but it was obstructing my view. So I went ahead and got rid of it. When we're looking from the bottom at the skull, we can still see the same bones. So here in the back is the big occipital bone. Remember some of our bone markings we talked about. The bump back here is the external occipital protuberance. Then we had those nuchal lines that we see on either place. There's that big foramen magnum that we see there. Here, we're going to get rid of parietal bones. But we also see these markings right here. Let me go into the bone marking mode on it. Having trouble, sorry. Here's these two markings right here. These are called the occipital condyles. That word condyle was another thing that meant that it was some kind of bump. The occipital condyles are the places where your skull articulates with the vertebrae. So the occipital condyles, we'll go back to normal here. Occipital condyles are the two structures I use to rest the skull on top of the vertebral column. So I think that was the only other one we hadn't talked about. Those zygomatic processes, let's see. Zygomatic process on the temporal bone right here, temporal process on the zygomatic bone, and there's that little styloid process again. Oop, I'm freezing up. My computer's getting mad, saying we are thinking way too hard. There we go. What do we want to do? We got 10 minutes left. We've looked at a lot of the bone markings. Yeah, Karina, it's a good time to put on your thinking cap, right? The skulls that we have in the classroom, the skull cap, so the top part of the skull, it is cut off. And inevitably, every class that we're working with the skull models, somebody drops one, and I tell them, hey, don't lose your head. So we missed out on that since we're not playing with skulls. But yeah, put on your thinking cap, don't lose your head, all that kind of stuff is fair. Okay, so Jacqueline's asking if we can do the origin and insertion activity. So sure, let's spend the rest of our time here, the little bit we have left, we'll do that activity together. Let me pull up, I've got a slide with that so we can draw on it. That is this one right here. Okay. Before we go through and do any of our drawing or any of our figuring out stuff, remind me, when we talk about a muscle, is it the origin or the insertion that's going to move when a muscle contracts? Does the origin or the insertion move? Yeah, exactly. The insertion is the part of a muscle that moves when that muscle contracts. So if you know the places that a muscle contracts, and you know which one is the origin and which one is the insertion, you can predict the way that that muscle moves. So we're working on these activities that we have at the end of all of these lab packets. The goal is to help you visualize, I've got an origin, I've got an insertion, how is my muscle going to move? So we're going to start with our origin here of a muscle called sternocleidomastoid. Sternocleidomastoid has a terribly long name, but that name tells us all of the places that it attaches. So one of these bone markings is a bone marking from last week, or 2 weeks ago, actually. It's been a little while. When we talked about the sternum, the chest bone. So the first bone marking that we have that's an attachment site for the sternocleidomastoid muscle is something called the manubrium of the sternum. Hey, go ahead and grab the pencil. Make sure you see a little blue circle over here. Can you show me where the manubrium of the sternum is? Here's my whole sternum right here. Which part is the manubrium of the sternum? Yeah, absolutely right. It's this top part up here, right? So the manubrium of the sternum is here. Perfect. That's the place where sternocleidomastoid attaches. That and the clavicle. So I'll add a little bit of blue here for our clavicle. We've got the manubrium of the sternum. We've got the clavicle. That is the sternocleido part of its name. Cleido means clavicle. So sternocleido. The mastoid process That's the last part of its name, mastoid. The mastoid process is something found on the temporal bone. If you happen to remember where that is, click on the pencil and then change the color green. Does anyone happen to remember where the mastoid process is? We talked about it fast. So it's on the temporal bone. If you were to describe the temporal bone, where would you say the temporal bone is? Do we remember where the temporal bone is? Okay, so we got some guessing going on. We're getting there. Okay, so we found our mastoid process. We colored it blue, but we found it. Let me draw really fast. I'll color it with green right here. The mastoid process is the big thing that extends down off the bottom of the temporal bone. This whole thing right here is the temporal bone. So the temporal bone, remember, is found kind of in the ear region, in the temporal region of the body. There's a big triangle that extends down from this region. So I'll delete my circle so you can see it again. This triangle of bone is called the mastoid process. So the mastoid process is the other attachment site of my muscle here. So I get to do some connect the dots here. We're connecting to the manubrium of the sternum. We are connecting to the clavicle. The sternocleidomastoid is the muscle in your neck. Sometimes it's called the whiplash muscle. If you get whiplash, this is what gets sore. When you're looking at these two attachment sites here, and again, no one can see you, so I'd encourage you to physically do this on your body. We're trying to figure out what would happen if my insertion moved toward my origin. So my insertion was the mastoid process. I want to move my mastoid process toward my clavicle and my manubrium. When I move the mastoid process toward the clavicle and the manubrium, do I do extension or flexion? Which way is my head going to move when this moves toward this? Yeah, so a couple of us are right. And like I said, please, no one can see you. Please do this movement. So you can move your mastoid process toward your sternum and clavicle. Your head is going to go forward like this. Our head's going to move. Let me make a little arrow here. Head's going to go like this. We're going to do flexion of the skull, moving the skull laterally. Or excuse me, moving it anteriorly. Karina asked if we can do hyperflexion. So we can't really do hyperflexion. We can do hyperextension, which is when a body part goes farther backwards than anatomical position. Some of our muscles of the back do what we might consider could do hyperextension. We generally, though, would just say that they're extensors. But yeah, since we're going forward, there's not a hyperflexion, just regular flexion. Some of those back muscles could pull the head way far back, and that would be what we might consider hyperextension. I think there were two parts to this question. Yeah, I only got one on my notes here. When we're thinking about this attachment site coming here, sternocleidomastoid is found in your neck on both sides. So when you were moving just now, when we were moving our entire head forward, that was the work of the sternocleidomastoid muscles on both sides of your neck, pulling the skull forward. When we talk about just one of these contracting, if the other one's not doing anything, what would end up happening with your head is we would rotate the head. Because imagine if you're not pulling both of those attachment points where the skull goes forward, maybe you're just taking something that's over by your ear and you're turning it closer to your sternum and your clavicle. That's rotation. That's not the word. The other option was elevating. Does anyone remember what elevating means? It's not tricky. What does elevate mean? What does an elevator do? Yeah, Gloria's right. Bringing something higher. When we're talking about this muscle right here, I'm going to either pull my head down lower if both of them contract to pull me toward my insertion, or I'm going to rotate to the side. There's nothing that I'm doing here that's going to make my head go higher, right? There's no muscle attachment that's making my head go up. So the two things that we might say that the sternocleidomastoid muscle does, one is when this rotates the head to the side, when just one of them contracts, or when both of them contract, when I'm pulling from the other side back there as well. That's what we would say is flexion, or bending forward, bringing things together. How do we feel? It's a crazy day, right? And we're only half done because we got our lecture session tonight. It's a big day in anatomy, right? Any last minute questions, thoughts, etc.? What muscle retracts the mandible is a question that we have. Let me go back here, see if any of us, when we're looking for a muscle that's going to retract the mandible, it's going to be a muscle that's found farther back. So when we're looking at, well, let me make a corollary to that question. That word retract, what does retract mean? Do we remember? Retraction. Yeah, so to bring backwards. Retraction is when we pull backwards. Protraction would be when we pull forwards. When we're thinking about trying to get the mandible to move backwards, we would need a muscle that's attached to it that's found kind of toward the back side. So when we're talking about retracting the mandible, one of the muscles that's going to help us with that is the temporalis muscle. Let me see if I still have visible body up here, because we have a good bones and muscles. Bear with me as I zoom in on temporalis, and then I'll share it with you. He is hiding, so he's hard to see. Where is, oh, I lost everyone. Where's that one? Where's that screen? That awkward moment when you have way too many screens going on. Here we go. Give it a moment to catch up. Okay. My mandible is hiding underneath here. So my mandible is hiding underneath here. Here is one of my bones that helps with elevating the jaw. We had a question about that. Yes. So here's my masseter. That's a big elevator of the jaw, makes the jaw go higher. I'm going to get rid of that so I can see down a little bit deeper. This one here is my deep part of it, so I'm going to get rid of that too. That's going to help me to see. I think this is my little branch right here. Nope. Where's he hiding? Temporalis. I'm having trouble finding it. There's my fascia, my connective tissue on it. But yes, the short answer to your question that I'm doing a terrible job showing you is that temporalis is the one that would protract it, would pull it backwards. So temporalis and the masseter, yes, they both elevate the jaw. And then the temporalis also pulls it backwards because parts of the temporalis are found back behind where the jaw is. The masseter is right on top of it, so it can't pull it backwards, but the temporalis lives back behind it. That means it would be able to protract it or pull it backwards. Any other last minute questions? So I would recommend That's really creepy. I'm not gonna lie. I would recommend before you do the visible body assignments for this week, please take some time to play around in visible body to start identifying things. So finding the masseter, for example, finding orbicularis oris, orbicularis oculi. We don't have too many facial muscles, but I do want to make sure that you find them all. Oh, here, let me show you the one that we just drew, by the way, is this one right here. There's sternocleidomastoid attached to the mastoid process of the occipital bone and attached to the clavicle and the manubrium. So there's sternocleidomastoid. Play with the muscles, play with the bones. You have 2 assignments. Let me show you when we are in our folder for this week. Oh, that is too far back. Bear with me. When we are in the folder for this week, week 10, 2 assignments. One that is brain structures, one that's bones and muscles. So please make sure we remember to do both of them. Both of them are due on Friday night. Practice with the brain, practice with the bones and muscles, then go in and work on locating those things. And then of course we have our Blackboard-based assignment. As usual, that one is due on Sunday. So don't forget that one either. That's all I've got for this morning. Remember, today at 5 o'clock, we are going to keep working through lecture stuff. So if you're available, plan to stop by. We're going to talk about the next section in the packet, which is the way that the nervous system tells the muscular system to contract. So it's something called excitation, contraction, coupling. That's on the agenda for this evening. So if you are free, plan to stop by. I want to give you guys, because it's been a while, a parting penguin gift. So let me draw a penguin for you. Any last minute thoughts, comments, questions before we call it a day? Our penguin is excited that we survived the brain, at least kind of. All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. I will stick around for a couple minutes if you have any last minute questions. Otherwise, I hope to see you tonight.